What's going on guys, Jin here, and this is a Blizzard build updated from my previous one. I wanted to make a non-Uber version of the build for anyone who was still struggling to get those to drop. This build can clear around tier 100 to 110 pits. As I mentioned, it does so without any Ubers. For more builds like this, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell as it helps out the channel a lot. Thanks YouTube viewer, now let's get to the build. So starting with the skill tree, we're going to take 2 into Firebolt, we're going to take 1 into Frozen Orb and go for Greater Frozen Orb, we're going to take 1 into Potent Warding, and then come down to defensive skills, we're going to take 1 into Flame Shield, 5 into Teleport, taking Shimmering Teleport, 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, 1 into Ice Armor, and go for Shimmering Ice Armor. In the Conjuration skills, we're going to take 1 into Ice Blades, and we're going to go for Summoned Ice Blades. Then we're going to take Lightning Spear, and go for Invoked Lightning Spear. Then we're also going to take 3 into Conjuration Mastery, 3 into Protection, 3 into Mana Shield, and of course the 1 into Align the Elements. In our Mastery skills, we're going to take 1 into Icy Veil, 1 into Blizzard, and go for Mage's Blizzard. Then we're going to take 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blaze. Next up in our ultimate skills, we're going to go for the 3 into Permafrost, 3 into Hoarfrost, 3 into Frigid Breeze, and 3 into Icy Touch. So that's 3 into all of those abilities. And lastly, in our key passive, we're going to be taking Shatter. Alternatively, if you need a little bit more tankiness, then you would remove Shatter and take Veer's Mastery instead. Next up, we have the Paragon Board. So for our first board, we're going to go with the Tactician Glyph, and that's going to give us 125% bonus to all rare nodes within range, but also you deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill, and this duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on our action bar. For our second board, we're going to go for the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put in the Elementalist Glyph. So it's going to give us fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy, increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. And also Paragon nodes within range gain 75% bonus to their non-physical damage and damage reduction modifiers. For our third board, we're going to go for the Icefall board, making sure we take the legendary node. And we're going to put in the Winter Glyph here. This gives us 125% bonus to rare nodes within range, and also whenever we chill or freeze an enemy, we do a 4% increased cold damage for 10 seconds, up to 18%. For our fourth board, we're going for the Frigid Fate board, making sure we take the legendary node as well, and we're going to go for the Stalagmite Glyph here, so that's going to increase our Ice Spike damage, and also Ice Spikes gain 20% critical strike chance. For our fifth board, we're going to be taking the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to put in the Destruction Glyph here, so that's going to give us a lot of critical strike damage. Also, critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. Then we go up to our sixth board, we're taking the Searing Heat board, and we're going to put in the Control Glyph here, so damage to crowd controlled enemies. You also deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. And last but not least, seventh board, we're going to take the Static Surge board. And we're going to put in the Flame Feeder Glyph here for that damage to burning enemies, but also we deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. So pretty straightforward there, simple Paragon board. So if I went a little bit too fast for you there, don't forget to check the build planner in the description below, as that's going to have the full Paragon board, skill tree, as well as any notes, and of course the gear and the enchantments as well. So next for the enchantments. For our first enchantment, we're going to be taking the Frozen Orb enchantment, so whenever we cast a non-basic skill, we have a 30% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at a nearby enemy. So the explosion from Frozen Orb has a 40% chance to make all enemies hit vulnerable for 3 seconds, and frozen enemies are always made vulnerable. So this is basically where most of our vulnerable proccing comes from. And our second enchantment is going to be the Firebolt enchantment, so direct damage from skills applies up to an additional 23% burning damage over 8 seconds. And this is how we're going to proc our Devouring Blaze, and also our Flame Feeder glyph. So that's it for the enchantments. Next up we have the gear. So as usual with the gear, on the left I'm going to put the affixes that you would want to get, and the tempering you would want to try and get. So starting with the Helm, we're going to go for a Godslayer crown here. That's going to give us some max life, damage, CC duration, and cooldown reduction. Also, when you stun, freeze, or immobilize an enemy or damage a boss, it pulls in nearby enemies and you deal 30 to 60% increased damage for 3 seconds. This effect can only occur once every 12 seconds. Now if you don't have a Godslayer crown, you would want to use a helm with intelligence, cooldown reduction, and max life. You would temper that with max life and lucky hit percent chance to immobilize. And for the aspect, you would want to use Everliving here, so you take 10 to 25% less damage from CC'd or vulnerable enemies. As for the masterworking, for both of these helms you would want to masterwork the cooldown reduction. Next up, we have the chest piece. We're just going to use a normal chest piece with intelligence, mana per second, and armor. We're going to temper that with total armor percent and lucky hit percent chance to freeze. For the aspect, we're going to use the Snowguards aspect here, so while within your own blizzard, and for 3 seconds after leaving it, you take 15 to 30% less damage. And we're going to try and masterwork the intelligence here. Next we have the gloves, and we're going to look for gloves with crit chance, attack speed, and crit damage. We're going to temper that with ice spike damage and lucky hit percent chance to stun. For the aspect, we're going to use Conceited, so we deal 10 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. And we're going to try and masterwork the ice spike damage here. Next up we have the pants. We're going to be using Tybalt's Will. That's going to give us damage reduction from close, and of course the unique aspect. We deal 10 to 20% increased damage while unstoppable and for 5 seconds after, and when we become unstoppable we gain 50 of our primary resource. We also get a little bit of max resource and some potion capacity as well. You're going to try and masterwork the damage reduction from close enemies here. And if you don't have access to Tybalt's Will, you would use pants with intelligence, max life, and also armor. But if you're going to use the armor on the pants, then you could use defensive skills instead of armor on the chest piece. So we're going to temper that with max life and crowd control duration. And as for the aspect, we're going to use the aspect of concussive strikes, so damaging an enemy has up to a 20% chance to daze them for 2 seconds, and you deal 5 to 20% increased damage to dazed enemies. Next up we have the boots. We're going to be using Esu's Heirloom here. That's going to give us move speed for 4 seconds after killing an elite, critical strike damage, and mana cost reduction. Also, your crit chance is increased by 20 to 30% of your movement speed bonus, so that's really important here, as this is how we're going to get near to 100% crit chance with our ice spikes. And we're going to try and masterwork the crit strike damage or the mana cost reduction. If you don't have access to Esu's Heirloom, you're going to want to use boots with intelligence, mana per second, and movement speed. You would temper that with teleport cooldown reduction and lucky hit percent chance to slow. And as for the aspect, you would use the aspect of the Banding Conduit, so teleport's cooldown is reduced by 1 to 2.5 seconds, which is the main thing we want. Next up we have the weapon. We're going to be using a staff here, so two-handed weapon, and we're going to look for the intelligence, critical strike damage, and mana cost reduction on the affixes. And we're going to try and temper this with ice spike damage and lucky hit percent chance to deal poison damage. As for the aspect, we're going to be using Glacial here, So when we cast Blizzard, it will periodically spawn exploding ice spikes that deal 6,177 damage with a perfect roll, and your ice spikes will deal 30% increased damage to frozen enemies. So we put this on our two-handed weapon for the 200% bonus, because most of our damage with this build comes from the ice spikes. So we want to get that base damage as high as possible for those. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the ice spike damage here. Next up we have the Amulet. We're going to be using an amulet with crit chance, attack speed, and ranks into Hoarfrost. And we're going to temper that with ice spike damage and resource cost reduction. We're going to put on the Storm Swell aspect here to deal 23 to 45% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. And we're going to try and masterwork the Hoarfrost. Next we have the rings. We're going to use Talrash's Iridescent Loop. That's going to give us non-physical damage, lucky hit chance, resource generation, and cooldown reduction. For each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 60%, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. So with this build we'll have all 4 elements. That's going to give us 60% in my case, multiplicative damage from this ring. As for the masterworking, we want to try and masterwork the non-physical damage. For our secondary ring, we're just using a normal ring with crit chance, attack speed, and crit damage. As for the tempering, we're going to temper it with ice spike damage and resource cost reduction. For the aspect, we're going to put on the aspect of Shredding Blades, so Ice Blade's chance to apply vulnerable is increased by 20%, and the vulnerable duration is increased by 4 seconds. You gain 15 to 30% vulnerable damage as well, multiplicative. If you don't have access to the Talrash's, you would use a duplicate of this ring. And for the aspect, you would want to use Prodigies on that one, so using a cooldown restores 10 to 25 mana. So it's pretty straightforward there gear wise. As for the gems, we're going to be using the diamonds in the rings. In the necklace, we're going to go for a skull. In the weapon, we're going to be using the emeralds. And in the armor, we're going to be using the rubies. So that pretty much wraps up the build. As I said, it can clear tier 100s to 110s-ish without any Ubers. So give it a go if you don't have any of those items. If you do have access to Ubers, you would want to use the Ring of Starless Skies and the Harlequin Crest as your secondary ring, and obviously the Helm. And yeah, that pretty much wraps up the build. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video or learned something, or you just happen to make it this far, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Really helps out the channel a lot, and I appreciate it so much. Thanks again, and I'll leave you with some blizzarding action, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!